Life as a single mom has never been easy, especially since things fell apart with my daughter's father during my pregnancy. When he couldn't remain faithful, even after she was born, I made the difficult but necessary decision to end our relationship and ask him to leave. It was a painful chapter, but once my daughter arrived, I knew I had to focus on building a life for us. Today, however, it's not him I want to talk about but rather my family. Specifically my younger sister, Ava. After the breakup, I moved back in with my parents. Being a single mom is challenging, and having their support seemed like a practical solution. For a while it worked. I found a job, and while they didn't help as much as they'd initially promised, it was enough to get by. That balance shifted dramatically a few days ago. I came home to find Ava, my 29-year-old sister, sitting in the living room. Ava and I have always had a strained relationship. Despite being the younger sibling, she's always acted superior and had an uncanny ability to manipulate our parents. Growing up, she turned them against me time and time again, playing the innocent card like a pro. While her words could cut, it was her physical presence that often made me feel genuinely unsafe. She's always been stronger and more intimidating. Whenever I tried to explain how her bullying affected me, my parents dismissed it, saying, "She's your little sister. How could she possibly hurt you?" Moving out for high school felt like escaping a prison. But now, years later, Ava was back. Not for a visit, but to stay. When I asked my mom how long Ava planned to stay, Ava herself answered sharply from the other room, "I'm here to stay." Got a problem with that. Her tone was the same self-centered, dismissive one I remembered from our childhood. My mom then explained that Ava's husband had been transferred back to the States and, despite having company housing, they thought it best for Ava to stay with my parents during her pregnancy and postpartum period. I couldn't believe it. The contrast was stark and painful. When I had my daughter, I didn't receive even half the support Ava was now getting. I asked my mom if she really had the time and energy to care for a newborn, and she replied meekly, "Well, Ava's still so young. How could she raise a child alone?" Ava is 29. I was 27 when I had my daughter, and I managed postpartum practically on my own because my ex wasn't around. My mom didn't even come to help me back then, saying motherhood was something I needed to figure out myself. Yet here she was now, cooking meals for Ava, making her comfortable, and bringing her supplements. It felt like a slap in the face. The favoritism in my family, which had always been obvious, now seemed unbearable. When I'd first moved back in with my parents, it had been under the guise of practicality. My dad insisted their house was too big for just the two of them and assured me they'd help care for my daughter while I worked. I paid rent and, though my mom helped babysit occasionally, it was far less than she'd promised. Most of the time, I had to hire a nanny. Even then, my mom acted more as a supervisor, monitoring the nanny rather than actively helping. Now, with Ava moving in permanently, it felt like my daughter and I were being pushed out. The house wasn't big enough for all of us, and I could feel the shift in my parents' priorities. Moving out wasn't a simple option for me. I still needed their support, limited as it was. Then the unthinkable happened. A few days after Ava moved in, I came home from work, exhausted but excited to spend time with my daughter. The moment I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. There on the porch were my belongings. Suitcases, boxes, and bags, piled haphazardly. Sitting next to them was my daughter, curled up with her knees hugged to her chest, looking small and scared. I rushed to her, my chest tightening as I tried to hold back tears. Stroking her hair, I whispered reassurances, though I was barely holding myself together. After calming her, I grabbed our things and marched into the house, determined to get answers. What I found inside would forever alter my relationship with my family. I stepped inside the house, and the scene before me stopped me in my tracks. Ava was sprawled across the couch, her fingers mindlessly scrolling through her phone, a self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips. My mother was busy in the kitchen, acting as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened, while my father remained glued to his armchair, his eyes fixed on the TV. The air was thick with indifference, a stark contrast to the warmth I had once associated with this place. It was as if my daughter and I had become invisible, our presence no longer welcome. My disbelief quickly turned into anger. Ava, utterly unfazed, glanced up casually and remarked that they needed more space now. Her tone was dismissive, as if my existence had become a mere inconvenience. Moments later, my mother emerged from the kitchen, a towel in her hands, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. She reminded me, almost flippantly, that I'd always known this arrangement was temporary. According to her, Ava needed peace and quiet to focus on her pregnancy, and my time in the house was up. Her words felt like a punch to the gut. After everything I'd done, paying rent, helping with chores, contributing to the household, they were discarding me and my daughter without warning, as if we were nothing more than a burden. My father, without even looking up from the TV, muttered something about Ava needing their full support, as if that justified their betrayal. Ava watched the whole exchange with an infuriatingly smug expression. It was clear she was reveling in the chaos she had orchestrated. Her satisfaction churned my stomach, but I knew arguing was futile. My parents had made up their minds, and any plea for fairness would fall on deaf ears. With a heavy heart, I took my daughter's hand, gathered our belongings, and left the house I had once called home. It hurt more than I could put into words, but I refused to let them see me break. In the days that followed, I channeled my anger and hurt into action. I contacted the bank to inform them that I would no longer be paying the mortgage on my parents' house, a loan that was, after all, in my name. Without my financial support, they would face significant consequences. I also hired a lawyer to ensure they couldn't legally evict me without proper notice, complicating their plans even further. Meanwhile, I found a modest apartment for my daughter and me. It wasn't grand, but it was ours, a safe haven where we could begin to rebuild our lives. For the first time in weeks, my daughter slept peacefully, free from the looming fear of being tossed out. As expected, the fallout was swift. A few weeks later, my parents received notice that their house was going into foreclosure. My mother called me, her voice trembling with panic as she begged me to reconsider. She accused me of being cruel, claiming Ava couldn't handle the stress during her pregnancy. Her pleas only deepened my resentment. Stress. I thought bitterly of everything my daughter and I had endured, and a dry, bitter laugh escaped me. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, and for a fleeting moment, I thought my mother might finally understand the gravity of what they had done. But it no longer mattered. I was done. Ava's attempts to reach out were just as desperate. Text after text, call after call. I ignored every single one. They were reaping what they had sown, and I refused to be dragged back into their mess. Eventually, the house was sold, and my parents were forced to downsize into a cramped apartment. Ava and her husband, stripped of their expected comfort and luxury, had to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, I focused on my new beginning. I found a better job, saved money, and built a life for my daughter and me. Our small apartment became a sanctuary, a warm, loving space untouched by the toxicity of my past. When family members tried to guilt-trip me or demand help, I smiled calmly and reminded them that they had made their choices. Now they had to live with them. Months turned into a year, and with each passing day, the weight of the past grew lighter. My daughter thrived in our little haven, and I found peace in the life we were creating together. The pain of betrayal lingered, but it no longer defined me. We were free, and that was more than enough. I discovered a peace I never imagined possible. The quiet was like a balm to my soul, and the realization that no one could humiliate or undermine me again became my source of strength. Slowly but surely, I began to smile again. Securing a new job marked the turning point. It paid better and offered the flexibility I needed to care for my daughter. With careful planning, I saved enough to move us into a larger apartment in a serene neighborhood, one with a reputable school nearby. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. Even as I moved on, news about my parents and Ava trickled back to me. They were hitting rock bottom, and to my surprise, I felt no pity. My parents had lost their home and were now living in a modest apartment in a less-than-ideal part of town. My father's pension barely covered their expenses, forcing my mother to take a job as a pharmacy cashier, an occupation that swiftly stripped away her once proud demeanor. As for Ava, her life was unraveling even more rapidly. Without the privilege and support she had always taken for granted, she was left to care for her child on her own. Her husband, unable to cope with the stress of being the sole provider, began to distance himself. Their arguments grew bitter and frequent, until one day, he walked out. Ava had believed returning to the U.S. would be her salvation, but reality proved her wrong. With my parents struggling and no one else to turn to, she found herself alone, overwhelmed, and utterly unprepared for the challenges of motherhood. Unlike me, Ava had never learned to stand on her own 2 feet. Her life spiraled further as she wallowed in self-pity, flooding social media with posts blaming everyone else for her predicament. She pushed away friends who tried to help, leaving herself completely isolated. At one point, she leaned on my parents for support, but their financial struggles rendered them incapable of helping her. Then they turned to me. My mother called one day, her voice laced with desperation. She begged me to help Ava, insisting she needed me now more than ever. She pleaded, reminding me of the importance of family and forgiveness. But as I listened, all I could think about was how different their attitude had been when my daughter and I needed their support. Back then, they had shown no concern for our struggles. So why should I care now? When my mother finished speaking, I responded with a calm but resolute, no, they had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. She began to cry, attempting to sway me with guilt, but I ended the call before she could finish. I had no space in my life for people who only turned to me when they were desperate. After that, the calls stopped. I later learned from distant relatives that Ava and her baby had ended up in a shelter, while my parents were selling off their furniture to cover mounting debts. They had burned every bridge and now had no one left to rely on. Meanwhile, my life flourished. My job was going exceptionally well, and for the first time, I was able to save money. My daughter and I built a life that was truly ours. I went back to school, taking classes to improve myself, and rediscovered hobbies I had long forgotten. Each small step forward made me stronger, more confident, and happier. Weekends became dedicated to my daughter. Together, we visited parks, explored museums, and went on little trips. We didn't need much, just each other and the comfort of knowing we were finally free from chaos. Watching her laugh and smile was a constant reminder that every hardship I endured was worth it. When I reflected on the past, I no longer felt sadness or anger. Instead, I felt gratitude. Being cast out had forced me to find my strength. The struggles had taught me never to settle for less than I deserved. Most importantly, I was grateful for letting go of the people who never truly cared about me. My parents and Ava were now trapped in the consequences of their choices, while I thrived. I didn't feel sorry for them, not even a little. Life has a way of delivering its own form of justice. I realized the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about moving forward, living well, and finding happiness. And that's exactly what I did. Every single day, I moved forward, lighter and happier, while those who had tried to pull me down faced the weight of their actions.